vagaries to the train. So whilst he is watching and participating, we agreed probably it was the least risk course for me to chair the whole event. Firstly, just getting through some of the sort of background, we have the minutes from the meeting of the 24th of March, which should have been circulated, and are just welcome any comments regarding their accuracy and any matters arising. I will take silence as golden, as meaning that people are happy with that. As I said, this is the in this way. I think probably to say an industrial revolution. The East of England was a fringe player, was a supporting actor. In the race to net zero, we are a lead actor. We are both a hub for offshore wind development that is taking place off our coast, and also the enormous opportunities in green hydrogen production. And what this evidence session will do, we'll look at the complex issues around delivering accelerated change in energy and land use. We will examine the wide range of challenges this presents, whether it's to local authorities, to businesses, and individuals and citizens in the East of England. And I think probably most importantly, we will highlight the actions that we need from government and others in positions of influence to make so as to support this transformation and really ensure that the East of England does play in great role we do have potential to play to its absolute potential, absolute maximum. Previously, we wrote to Kwasi Kwarteng when he was energy minister. He's now obviously Secretary of State, raising a number of questions relevant to the session today. We haven't had a reply, but I think we fully appreciate he's got an enormous lot on his plate. But in the light of what we discussed today, we may well decide that we need to have a follow-up letter to him. Anyway, that's just a bit of the introductions. I'll now move on to our first set of speakers who are going to speak to us each for 10 minutes. Firstly, we're absolutely delighted to have this with us this morning, Baroness Brown of Cambridge. She was Vice Chair of the Climate Change Committee, which I think you would say is the absolute barometer by which we mark the country's progress on this journey. And she also has a fully local involvement in how the East of England performs, in that she chairs the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Climate Commission. And then our second speaker in this session is Daniel Johns, who most attendees of the APPG will know well, as he represents Anglian Water, one of the group sponsors. And as head of affairs for Anglian Water, Daniel will present their perspective on this matter. And obviously Anglian Water do have an enormous footprint across our region. So first of all, over to Baroness Brown. It's great to have you with us this morning, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk to you with my chair of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Climate Commission hat on. So I just want to whiz you very quickly through some slides. We've been going as a commission since the late autumn last year, and we produced our first report or our first interim report in ahead of the PERDA period for the local elections. We're just about to get back with our first meeting post the elections, and of course with a new mayor for the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough combined authority. So our first meeting to get on with the second phase of the first piece of our work is actually at the end of this week. But let me just say the reason why this is important is because in the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough area, our emissions per head are some 25% above the UK average, and they are falling more slowly. That's partly because, of course, we are a growing region, but it's actually partly because we have very high per capita transport emissions. We're a region that really needs to act on climate change. We're a region that is seeing sort of a really fast rise in the maximum temperatures. And of course, in the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge in 2019, we saw 38.7 degrees, the highest temperature in the UK. We're also a region which grows an enormous amount of the country's salad crops in the fens, but we're, as I'm sure Daniel will talk about, we're in danger of drought and water shortage in our region, made particularly challenging by all of the new housing that is likely to be coming into the region. We are, despite being a drought area, also potentially suffering from significant risk of flooding, and of flooding in some areas where we have quite a lot of important infrastructure. So we need to do something. And this graph shows you where our business as usual emissions are going. If we are to be online for our share of delivering net zero, we need to move from that green dotted line to this purple dotted line. And if we continue along that green line, we will use up our fair share on a per capita basis of the emissions we can emit before we need to get to net zero. We'll use that up within the next 8 years. So action is truly urgent in our part of the region. So our approach to this has been to say, we want to have a picture for residents in the region of the benefits of the right kinds of policies in delivering climate change mitigation and making us a region that is resilient to the ongoing changes that we will see in the climate. And we see as the really important levers to deliver this change, we see nature, education, people's behavior, a hugely important role for innovation, for, of course, communications, etc. So this is our, if you like, integrated systems model that we've used to drive our thinking and that we think should be used to drive policy and communication to deliver change. So local government clearly has an enormously important role to play in this. The transport, the planning and the borrowing are absolutely key. But we also think bringing together all of the key stakeholders and making sure that they are talking to each other. And that's been one of our major concerns. So it's an enormous task for us in the region. We've got over 500,000 vehicles, which all need to be zero emission. So we're going to need lots of EV charging. And we've got to reduce transport emissions, which has an impact on our planning, on how far we drive rather, which has an impact on our planning and making sure all of the developments are connected to good public transport and cycling and other opportunities of that sort. We've got almost 500,000 buildings, homes rather, which are below EPC, so not yet suitable for heat pumps, though they're going to need to be well insulated and converted to low carbon heat. And we have this huge pressure of new build. So 40% of our homes by 2050 could have been built between now and 2050. So it is absolutely essential that they're built to the highest efficiency standards for heat, but of course that they're well ventilated and well shaded because of the high temperatures we're going to be experiencing. But it's also absolutely crucial that they are built to the very, very highest water efficiency standards because of the danger of drought in our region. So local authorities, combined authorities need the sort of planning powers that really enable them to make sure we're building housing stock which is appropriate to the region. We're going to need quite a lot of investment, 700 million per annum in the transport and the buildings area, the things that local authorities can control. And we think we need to see the combined authority using its borrowing powers to leverage in capital from the private sector and also to leverage government initiatives so that we can make the kind of investments we need. And of course, we have the fens, a huge and important area of lowland peat, which is absolutely critical to our emissions reduction, but also to food production. So we have some really challenging considerations about land use and peat rewetting, and we also have a need for a real push on more green space and using nature-based solutions. So we have a lot of recommendations in our first report, very detailed recommendations on transport and housing, but just to mention a few high-level ones, we think there needs to be a climate cabinet for the region. We have been quite shocked in talking to, for example, the UK power networks at how little visibility they have of forthcoming planning proposals and planning applications, for example, for things like solar farms. They don't get to see these at the moment until they get to the formal planning application stage. So their ability to be talking to their regulator about investment in advance of need is extremely limited. So we think we really need a climate cabinet that brings together the Anglian Water and Cambridge Water and the NHS, the electricity network, etc., with the council leaders to make sure they are planning together for the changes we need. This needs to be supported by a funded delivery team in the combined authority level who have a climate action plan with proper targets, actions and monitoring. And we think also we need a green investment team. We don't want every small council trying to do this, but this is going to need really skilled people because we've got to find a way of finding that upfront investment of some 700 million per annum for the region. So our first full report will come out in late September, and we haven't yet got on to talking about a whole range of things in our first report. And one of the things we're really going to be picking up is the role of business and industry and the role of innovation, because we feel that we have this enormous resource in the universities and colleges and research institutes in our region. And we have some areas of real strength like buildings and sensor technologies and digitization and agri-tech that are going to be absolutely crucial to the transition. But we don't yet see that those are having the same success as, for example, life sciences does in terms of the innovation ecosystem in the region. And so we're going to be looking at what it is we need to do to make sure that those are all really contributing both to the net zero transition, to making us resilient, but also to the economy of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough area. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I will stop there.
Baroness Brown, very many thanks for that thought-provoking introduction. So certainly you set my mind running about what we should be doing across the whole region. And of course, one of those features you mentioned was water, which we have taken for granted for a long, long time. But actually, it's becoming an increasingly a resource that we have to manage prudently. And in that perspective, I can now bring Daniel Johns, who's Head of Public Affairs at Anglian Water. Daniel, look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, and hopefully my screen has also pops up on yours, so you can see my slides. I mean, it's obviously an honour to follow Baroness Brown today at this, at the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and just to really welcome the report that's already come out from the Independent Commission. If the next report is your first thorough report, Julia, then to be honest, I'm not. The first report is well worth the read. It's more than 100 pages of detailed, thorough, robust analysis. And it's a real, you've managed to achieve so much in such a short period of time. And we're delighted at Anglian Water, and me personally, that I'll be helping you develop the next report, particularly in terms of the analysis around nature, water, and the climate change challenge. And particularly, that's my first point, I guess, that when we're thinking about the race to net zero, let's not forget the race to resilience, because in the east of England, we have both of those challenges. We both need to reduce our emissions to zero as quickly as possible. And even if we do so, we will still be adapting to the impacts of climate change for 100, if not 200 years or more, particularly in terms of the low-lying aspects of our region. We talked about the water scarcity challenge, but let's not forget flood risk, which is the other side of the water resources coin. Sea level rise could rise by as much as a metre, if not more, by the end of the century. And a kind of 1 in 100 tidal surge event, which might happen today, could be as much as an every year event by the end of the century. But Anglian Water has obviously been thinking hard about climate change for a long time. As a water company, of course, we extract water from the environment, we put it back into the environment. That water scarcity challenge is real. We've been thinking about this for almost 30 years. We conducted our first climate change risk assessment back in the early 90s. We realised, of course, that we must, as a water company, end our contribution to climate change as quickly as possible. And that led to us setting our first climate change targets more than 10 years ago, committing to become our first carbon neutral company back earlier in 2016. And that was accelerated as part of a water industry-wide effort in 2019 to commit to carbon neutrality, a net zero target across the whole of the water sector by 2030 as part of a wider public interest commitment. And last November, the water sector published what we think is the first in the world, which is a detailed route map for a whole sector, whole industrial sector, to achieve net zero within a decade. And this is what the front page obviously looks like, but it's grounded in the analysis. It has various pathways in terms of what we actually need to do to each aspect of our emissions to achieve net zero by 2030. And following on from this sector-wide report, each individual water company will be publishing their own detailed plans to get to 2030 this summer. And of course, Anglian Water will be first amongst those. But what does that actually mean? Well, I think the net zero challenge means that we're kind of breaking out of the confines of what you might consider, traditionally to be the water company's remits. In fact, we're not really a water company anymore. We're becoming an energy company. At the very least, by 2030, we'll become a net exporter of clean, renewable energy. We already have anaerobic digestion. We generate huge amounts of biogas, which we use in combined heat and power plants on site to be able to power the anaerobic digestion process, to use that renewable heat. We're also becoming a major producer of renewable electricity. We have our own onshore wind farms. We've got massive plans already underway to roll out solar across the region. Last year, and this is 2019-2020 figures, 131 gigawatt hours of clean renewable power that was generated. It was a record year, and we know we're going to beat that considerably when the results come out for this year in a couple of weeks' time, because we've got a massive new solar array around the edge of Grafton Water, which you can see in the bottom left. And also, as part of the kind of contractual framework with our suppliers, we're also looking to storage technology. So on the right-hand side, you've got a big a flow battery, essentially. So it's kind of liquid battery ways of storing energy on site, so that we will no longer need diesel backup generators. That's the goal, to strip out fossil fuels from our operations, use clean solar energy that we generate ourselves as far as possible, and using storage on site to make sure that we have that energy when we most need it. We're also working more and more in partnership with others within the region to help tackle their emissions. And this is a really neat example of a kind of circular economy approach to growing vegetable salads. As the Baroness said, that obviously we produce a massive amount of the country's vegetables, salad crops, potatoes, and so forth. And this is one of two huge new greenhouses that are being built next to water recycling centres. There's one outside Bury St Edmunds and one outside Norwich. And that takes the waste heat within our sewage effluent that goes, it's treated, it goes back into the environment. We capture that heat before the water goes back. And we use that to pump heat year round into the greenhouse. And that's going to produce, I think, about 10% of the country's tomato crop, plus peppers, plus cucumbers. And by not flying those tomatoes in, by being able to produce those tomatoes year round, those tomatoes have a 75% lower greenhouse gas footprint, a lower carbon footprint. And that's just one example of where we're working increasingly in partnership with others around the region to tackle not only our emissions, but to tackle other people's too. And the last one, I think it's really important that there are a multitude of ways in which we as a water company can solve what might be considered kind of engineering challenges by working more closely with nature. So rather than reaching kind of pollution standards around wastewater effluent and bringing down levels of nutrients in the water that goes back into rivers, we can do so through additional treatment in wetlands. So this is a gravity-fed series of 4 lagoons next to our water recycling works at Inglethorpe. Before that water goes back into the local chalk stream, it goes through these reed beds and it's cleaned by the silt, the reeds, the other vegetation that's there, in a way which uses no electricity whatsoever. And we were delighted in December when we were told as a water company that we'd been given early approval by the Secretary of State to accelerate £317 million worth of investment as part of a wider water industry effort on the green recovery. And included within that money is now we've got the ability to take forward an additional 34 new treatment wetlands around the region, just because they're fantastic for carbon, they're fantastic for biodiversity, they're fantastic for amenity as well. You know, actually the Inglesthorpe wetland was planted not only with the help of the Rivers Trust, the Norfolk Rivers Trust, but actually by local school children. And finally, Baroness Brown mentioned the Fenland region, which of course is very much at risk from climate change, from rising sea levels. The chart on the left-hand side is essentially the area of land in Fenlands around the Wash. You'll notice some of the major towns listed there, from Lincoln, Kings Lynn, Boston, and in the centre, Wisbech. And what we're finding is that taking a place-based approach to climate change adaptation in this case, you can deliver much greater benefits, not just for the environment, but also social benefits and economic benefits. And we've been working in Wisbech for some time now, particularly because it's one of the most deprived parts of the country. It's kind of socially isolated. It's quite hard to get to Wisbech since the railway was closed all those decades ago. And because it's difficult to justify putting new infrastructure into this part of the country because it's so low-lying and because it's at such quite severe flood risk. It would cost huge amounts of money to raise particular roads, to build the railway in a way which would not itself be then at flood risk, because the flood risk is so severe. So how can we create the situation where the investment is going in to tackle those flood risk challenges, those water scarcity challenges, but also in a way which unlocks economic regeneration, levelling up, and we solve all these challenges together? Well, that's exactly what we've got now. Last week, we had a senior task force attended by Stephen Barclay, by Emma Howard-Boyd, and we even had the new Mayor for Greater Cambridgeshire, Dr. Nick Johnson, helping us to launch a task force to deliver this programme in practice, which is a combination of 2 new major reservoirs, which will obviously address the water scarcity challenge, but they'll be designed in ways which also help manage the flood risk challenge by managing water levels in these major Fenland rivers, combined with new downstream barriers and barrages built by the Environment Agency. And by addressing these things in combination, together with delivering greater biodiversity through open water channels, we think we can unlock regeneration in this part of the region. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, look forward to the discussion.
Daniel, very many thanks for that. Really opening it up now for Q&A. The first instance, can I just bring in Linda Hasey, Councillor Linda Hasey, who chairs the LGA locally. I'm conscious Linda needs to go to another meeting, but really to give a perspective from a local government perspective. Linda, over to you.
Yes, no, thank you very much indeed, and for inviting me to speak. I think local government obviously does have an extremely important role to play in all of this. I think one of the areas where we should be working much closer with developers, our large house builders, because they often just do not seem to get the fact that we need to build sustainable houses, and we do need very strong policy changes, which may or may not come through on the new planning white paper, to actually ensure that we are able to put the policies in place to make sure that they have to do it. You always get the argument as, oh, people don't want to pay for this. Well, actually, they are willing to do it. But again, it's something to put forward. And talking about Anglian water, you know, developers will put the water tanks far away from where you have baths and showers and do the washing up, which means you run the taps for absolutely ages to get hot water. So that is, again, absolute madness. I think the other thing is EV charging. If you live in old market towns, where do we put them? How do they work? We can't have wires trailing across pavements. They're just not, it's just not doable or safe. But again, we need to make sure we have the policies in place so that all new builds do have to put in a sufficient number of fast charging points. I was on a seminar yesterday with a number of councillors and a number of groups across East Hertfordshire looking at climate, and East Hert's had a climate change group now for many years. And I think one of the arguments that came up is, yeah, a lot of this is really great, but a lot of our residents can't afford to do stuff. You know, electric cars are amazing. I've got one, but a lot of our residents just cannot afford that extra premium of buying an electric car. So I think we have to start looking at how do we help individuals recognize that by taking some small steps in their life, we can have a cumulative effect. We need government to make sure that we have the powers to implement what we have to implement over the coming years. But we also need to be very clear on making sure that everyone understands the benefits of what we have to do, because we all want to leave a world to our children and our grandchildren. So government, help us with a bit of money and help us with changes in planning, and we might start getting somewhere. Thank you.
You're on mute, Peter.
It's a trick, it's a fault we all do, my apologies. Linda, very many thanks for that, for that perspective from a local government viewpoint. Can I open up to further any questions or observations people may have, depending on what Baroness Brown and Daniel Johns had to say? Any thoughts or any questions, anyone?
Can I just say how much I agree with Linda? The things Linda has just said have come across in spades in our discussions with our local councils and others doing in the first stage of work of the Climate Commission, because we've been focusing very much on housing and transport. And I would just say that you've really summed up very well the challenges we've been trying to think about and that have been relayed to us. And planning is absolutely key, and actually local government and combined authorities having more planning powers, because the planning has to be relevant for the local conditions in terms of climate change, particularly, as Daniel has emphasized so much, in particularly in terms of the impacts of climate change and how we're going to need to adapt to those, and the flood risk. These are all, and indeed maximum temperatures and things, these are all quite local issues. And what we may need to do in the east of England may be very different from what they need to do in the Lake District, for example. And so it isn't just a national one size fits all. It is about local powers to go way beyond what a national policy might kind of, what an umbrella national policy might need to look like.
Those further thoughts are very, very helpful. That's really appreciated. That's great. Many thanks, Baroness Brown. Karen Chapman has put her hand up, and she's put a note comment in the chat section. Karen, welcome your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for the presentations. They were really, really fascinating. And I've put the point in the chat, but it's just to reiterate, we've been doing a lot of work in Suffolk on our climate emergency plan. And I think that balance between retrofitting existing homes and looking at the percentage of new stock that's coming rings true. Fascinated to hear the shift from Anglian Water, from a water company to an energy company. But I think it's the point around that mass engagement on behavioural change, because we've done some work in the past, again with Anglian Water, looking at, for example, developers will put in low flow showers, or they'll put in a 3/4 bath in a new housing development. And within a month of moving in, people have ripped that 3/4 bath out and put in a full-sized one. So it's not a public engagement campaign that can be taken forward in isolation. It has to be done in partnership. And I just wondered, from an industry point of view, Anglian water is quite cutting edge. What tricks have you found do work quite well? How do you think going forward you could work with local government to get that message out and have it ring true a bit better? Thanks very much.
Many thanks for that, Karen. And Darren, I'm sorry, Daniel, apologies.
Me, Daniel, Peter.
Yep.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's really important to focus on behaviour change as one of the kind of tools in the toolbox, but not forget that it's really for the government to take the big strides. That's as part of the Climate Commission's work, that I hope, as well as obviously looking to the region, to the changes that can be made through the powers that local authorities have through the transport networks, through the buildings policies, through retrofit programs, but also using their voice to lobby government for some of the changes that need to be made as part of the planning policy. Obviously, we're very concerned about the planning bill and what that will mean for both energy efficiency, but also kind of water efficiency in the public realm. And just as one example, from a water point of view, at the moment, local plans published and trying to kind of get those through the planning inspectorate from a water efficiency perspective can go no further than the 110 litres design standard that's in building regulation. So in very fast and water scarce parts of the country, like the Oxford-Cambridge arc, where it would absolutely make sense to set a tighter water efficiency standard, that at the moment would be ruled out by the planning inspectorate. So one thing that needs to be done is that both the national building regulation need to be tightened both for energy and for water. And where there is a particular local need driven by water scarcity, then there needs to be the ability for planning authorities to go further.
Many thanks, Daniel. And Baroness Brown, any comments on Karen's observations?
No, well, I absolutely agree with Daniel. I also think that one of the messages we've had from the local councils in the region, because clearly there are sensitivities when you're suggesting that the combined authority should coordinate some things, because we have different local councils with different views about representing, as we've heard, some very different populations. But one of the things that they have been very keen can and should be done at a combined authority level is some more of this actually engagement and communication with people in the region. One of the things we're going to be trying in the region, actually focusing on the fens for the reason that Daniel flagged up, because that's parts of the fens are quite isolated and they're some of our most impoverished areas in the region, is we're teaming up with a charitable foundation who are partly funding us to do a climate assembly in the fens, to spend some really intense time with a representative group of the residents of the fens, to really bring them up to speed to understand the challenge of climate change and what we need to do, and to get them to a position where they can start to think about what it is they want for their part of the region that will enable them to be part of this transition. And that's something we're going to be launching very soon and running through the summer. So we're very interested to see what comes out of that.
And that was very helpful observation. I've appreciated that. And Daniel, do you want to come back in very quickly? I've got Daniel Zeitner wants to come in, and then Linda Hasey wants to come back. Daniel, very quickly.
Sorry, well, just very, very quickly. I think that's such an important point the Baroness Brown makes, because the Fenland region is both a climate, it's a net zero challenge in terms of the emissions from lowland peat, and there's also the climate resilience challenge that I've also set out. I mean, I should have mentioned that I'm a member of DEFRA's lowland agricultural peat task force, which is trying to find ways in which farmers can remain productive on lowland peat soils, but whilst making sure that we're actually moving things to a sustainable basis. And that will mean changes, to be quite frank. That will mean that not all land in the lowlands will continue to be farmed in the way that it is now, because the emissions from those soils are just too high.
Thanks. That's additional work, that observation, Daniel. That's appreciated. I'm not sure. Daniel Zeitner has put a question in the chat box, which I'll just quickly read. To Baroness Brown, he asked the question: what are the obstacles to the climate cabinet? he makes the observation that the combined authority hadn't always found it easy to engage with business. Any thoughts on that, Baroness Brown?
I don't know. The previous mayor had agreed to form it, but didn't want it called the Climate Cabinet. So we haven't yet met with the new mayor. So we're hoping that that he will regard this as a hugely important forum that he will personally want to chair. But the need for that coordination to be occurring on a reasonably large scale, a combined authority type scale, is just so important. And as I say, with our meetings with different organizations, it has become apparent there's quite a lot missing. So we think it's very important. I think the obstacles are going to be, how do you do it without having a cast of thousands? And how do you make sure that senior people really have it on their agenda? But then if senior people really have it on the agenda, how do you make sure they've then communicated what they've heard at that down through their organizations to the people who have to make it happen? So I think, you know, all the usual challenges, really.
And Linda, you wanted to quickly come back?
Yes, if I may. I think the problem with water is everyone doesn't see it as a utility and doesn't expect to have to pay for it, particularly when we've had the wettest May on record. So I think, again, it's helping people understand that it is a resource that we do have to pay for, and we have to pay realistically for it, which at the moment, I don't think we do.
That's Linda, many thanks for that further observation. Now the clock is ticking around to the next session. We have had two, looking in the chat box, Jennifer Allerton has put a comment about funding, and there's also one about the roadmap to net zero and the importance of government articulating a clearer set of milestones along the way. I think any final comments from either Baroness Brown or Daniel Johns to round off this particular session that has been very thought-provoking, certainly from my perspective, and I'm sure everyone else's.
Well, just for me to say thank you for inviting me and giving me a chance to tell you about what we're doing in the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough area, and very happy to, if there anything people want to follow up on, very happy to try and support that.
Many thanks indeed, Baroness Brown. It was a privilege for us to have you with us this morning. That was really kind of you to join. And Daniel?
Me too. Only say, just to remind you though, so our net zero plan will be coming out in, well, if not in June, then early July, and of course our circulator to members, and ready for any questions and discussions around us and helping other people deliver their net zero targets.
Daniel, many thanks, and special thanks, for what was a thought-provoking presentation. Anglia Water have clearly advanced beyond just being a water company, and that was greatly appreciated. Thank you. The second session is on the East of England's role in the race to net zero, is getting the infrastructure right. We've got 3 speakers who are going to speak for about 7.5 minutes before we have a Q&A session. And we start off with Sally Brewis. Sally is the Regional Development Manager for Cadent. And I think the observation I would make there is Cadent, British Gas, have an enormous infrastructure laid down across the region. In the race to net zero, we need to make sure that we fully utilize this infrastructure and don't discard it. So Sally, look forward to hearing from you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Peter. As you say, the gas network plays a significant role in the East of England already. So in just the East of England, we serve 4 million homes and businesses, supplying them with natural gas. But of course, we can't continue to use natural gas in net zero world. And therefore, we feel we need to play a hugely significant role in the energy transition. and in doing so supporting clean economic growth across the region. And more widely, just to give a bit of background on Cadent, so we manage a network of more than 80,000 miles of pipe, and we are doing a significant amount of work on hydrogen, which can be made in a low carbon way. So most of my comments focus on hydrogen. It's a topic I know is being hotly debated in Parliament right now. And it's timely to focus on hydrogen, with the government set to publish a hydrogen strategy next month. So as I say, hydrogen and low carbon gases will have a really important role to play in enabling net zero. You can make hydrogen in a low carbon way, so you can use renewable electricity or excess nuclear power, or you can make it by reforming natural gas and then sequestering the carbon dioxide for storage offshore. And I've got a couple of slides to show you a little bit later to show why we think the East of England is really well set up to play a very important role in the hydrogen economy. Hydrogen is a fantastic way of storing and transporting energy. It's been termed the Swiss Army knife of energy. So it can be used to decarbonise the hardest sectors, so whether that's heavy transport or marine or heating in buildings that it's hard to improve the energy efficiency. And hydrogen is number 2 in the PM's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. We believe it's a great opportunity for jobs and green economic growth across the region. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides. So firstly, I'm going to transport us up to, so I'm just going to transport us up to the northwest for a second. I don't intend to talk about this a lot, but for those of you who don't know a massive amount of hydrogen, Cadent is essentially leading the way in planning for the rollout of hydrogen in our networks. So starting with a 20% blend of hydrogen into our networks and transitioning to 100% hydrogen in our networks. And Hynet Northwest up in Merseyside is a fantastic example of a scheme that's based around an industrial cluster that can be used to generate and distribute low carbon hydrogen, and amazing economic benefits that are projected from that initiative. So we're expecting up to £3 billion worth of private investment into the region relating to that opportunity. I wanted to talk about hydrogen blending because Cadent sees hydrogen blending as a critical step. It encourages hydrogen production, and it means hydrogen blending opens up lots of opportunities for production, not just at the coast, which is where a lot of the attention goes, but also inland. We've identified various different blending points in our network, including 3 in the East of England region, and they can provide really good opportunities to stimulate low carbon hydrogen production inland. If we blended 20% hydrogen into our networks, or the networks in England, it's the equivalent of taking 2.5 million cars off the road. So, and this is just a transition step. And what the slide I'm most excited about is this one, which shows the hydrogen local transmission system that Cadent is planning in the East of England. So you can see in the orange here, this is where we think that we need to install a local transmission system that would enable the transition of towns and villages over to hydrogen. You can see that, and you probably know that, a lot of the hydrogen conversation is focused on the industrial decarbonisation clusters, whether that's in the Humber or the Northwest, as I've talked about. And we see hydrogen, some of the hydrogen coming down or linking down from those routes. But also you can see on the east side of the country, this is Baxton here, we see a hydrogen local transmission system moving all the way down the coast, picking up hydrogen that's produced along the coast and distributing it locally. And then we see East Anglia being a major supplier of hydrogen to London, which is obviously an enormous demand centre. But the key messages here are that you can use it locally, you can serve London, and from a skills perspective, it's a great way of transitioning, people working in oil and gas away from those industries and into low carbon industries such as hydrogen production. We can make fantastic use of the nuclear energy on the coast, for renewable energy offshore, and we can also make use of the natural gas infrastructure or disused natural gas infrastructure to sequester carbon dioxide and enable hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen made from reformation of natural gas. And as I said, also in this region, we can also look at inland hydrogen production and make use of those blending points inland to take that hydrogen. And my experience talking to potential hydrogen producers is that knowing that blending is a possibility can provide them with the base level really that they need for their business cases for hydrogen production. And that's why we think it's a really important thing for the government to get behind and support. The last thing to say is that a transition to hydrogen, 100% hydrogen, would require homes to change their boilers to hydrogen-enabled boilers to enable that transition. And that's another reason why we think it's quite important to mandate for hydrogen-ready boilers from 2025, because we need to make sure that whilst electricity will be used for increasingly for heating in some homes, we think that hydrogen is needed for that safety net for those hard to insulate properties. And therefore we need to make sure we're ready. Hydrogen boilers cost the same as a natural gas boiler, so why would you not mandate for those and make sure we're ready for those properties that can't have electric heating? So that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Very many thanks for that, Sally, and it was great to have sight of the proposed hydrogen local transition system. And talking about transmission sessions, our next speaker is Sara Habib, who is she's the Senior Project Manager East Coast for National Grid, who have the challenge of getting all this electricity we're going to be producing on and off our coast into the country's homes and businesses. Sara, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to talking to you about the challenge of connecting 40 gigawatts by 2030. I should warn you, I have a very lively Springer who has been particularly vocal this morning, so I'm sorry if she's in the background. I've just got a few slides to share with you. I've got quite a few, so I'm going to rattle through them. Hopefully, can you see those? I'm not sure. I'm going to rattle through them at pace, and I think the material will be sent out afterwards, and I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with anyone who wants to go into any more of the detail. But this is really about our pathway to 40 by 30. Just to navigate who you're talking to in terms of National Grid, we're quite a large organisation. And in terms of that 40 by 30 challenge, there are probably a number of elements of our business that you will speak to. And we have certain license conditions and activities and information we have to keep quite separate. So National Grid Ventures will typically come and talk to you about interconnectors to Europe, which play a key role in facilitating our transition to net zero. The ESO business, they are the ones that manage demand and supply second by second, and also send out and develop our energy scenarios, investment signals for what they need to have a safe, reliable, operable system. But I'm actually from National Grid Electricity Transmission. So we're the part of the business that own and operate the transmission network. And specifically are focused on how we have the right infrastructure in place onshore and also subsea bootstraps or offshore subsea cables to make sure that we can connect 40 gigawatts by 2030. And, I know everyone knows this, but it's just to get a sense of the scale of the challenge. We are world leading with 10 gigawatts of installed capacity, but by 2030, we need to install and quadruple that to 40 gigawatts. So it's huge. It's a huge step up. It's actually 9 years. And in major infrastructure project terms, that's actually quite a short deadline, because our major infrastructure projects to kind of build the investments you're talking about are typically 9 to 10 years, and they're usually quite discrete projects. These are very interacting, complex projects. So it's important, but it's a real challenge to get the right infrastructure in place by 2030. And it doesn't stop there, because obviously we're talking about much more offshore wind by 2050. So this is just the beginning of really reimagining our energy network to facilitate net zero. So specifically focusing in on the East Coast and the investments required, we're talking about just for national grid electricity transmission. And I always think, you know, we need to think wider than that, because there's the offshore wind farms, the interconnectors, the subsea cables that are required to connect to those wind farms. But just in terms of our infrastructure onshore and some of those key subsea links that will go from Scotland to Northern England and also along the East Coast, we're talking about well in excess of £10 billion worth of investment, around 600 kilometres new onshore routes and 1,300 of subsea cable. And a lot of it, obviously, off the East Coast means there's a huge amount of infrastructure impacting that eastern region. And we are really cognizant of how that's going to impact local communities and how we need to do this as thoughtfully as possible. We also then have, coupled with that, really tight timelines, as I alluded to earlier, and we need to strike a very careful balance between the need to meet our net zero targets, to connect that offshore wind, the cost to the UK consumer, but also how we do it in a meaningful, appropriate and whole systems thinking way for those local communities and for the local environment as well. So just to give you a sense of the scale and complexity of what we're doing, you know, we would say that this sort of infrastructure programme hasn't really been seen since the building of the modern grid in the 60s and 70s. You know, our transmission network is really built for traditional coal, gas and nuclear, and where that was located. We're now effectively relocating those sources of generation. And whereas historically we might have over the past several decades had 4, 5 at most major infrastructure projects, 40 gigawatts will need around 12 to 16 major projects. So this is significant, and it will only grow beyond 2030. And to give you, I've talked about the cost, but to give you a sense of the scale, if you lined up the cable and conductor we'd broadly need, it would get you from Portsmouth to Perth, and I mean Perth in Australia. So it's a huge amount of supply chain requirements as well. That's risk in itself, because we need to have enough resources, skills, supply chain, but it's also opportunity. You know, looking at just the cable and conductor, it's going to be a very constrained global market. But could we be building that cable and conductor, for example, in the UK? Is there real opportunity there for green industry in the UK to support all this infrastructure? So just really honing in on what we're focusing in on, and I'm really trying to work closely with others, with local communities, with governments, with BEIS, with through the Offshore Transmission Network Review, local authorities, NGOs as well, and environmental groups. We're trying to work across a few key themes. So sizing that delivery challenge, this really is a significant amount of infrastructure in quite a short amount of time. So really, what are the opportunities, timelines, how we're going to resource this, how we're going to get key materials, and what do we need to change in terms of policy and regulation to make this really believable and deliverable for 2030. We are also looking at engineering solutions. So how can we use multi-purpose interconnectors? That's something our National Grid Ventures part of the business is focused on and we're supporting in terms of the onshore infrastructure. How can we move to coastal energy hubs? So what are the early opportunities to coordinate? I don't know whether you're aware, but traditionally wind farms have connected radially, single kind of point-to-point connections. Where can we get shared infrastructure and assets so that we combine and minimize the impact on the coastline, and working and feeding that into the BEIS offshore network transmission review. But also, how can we be innovative and use things like smart wires to reduce the amount of infrastructure in the first place and bolster and reinforce the network before we have to build? And how can we future-proof it beyond 2030? So looking to higher voltages, using things like composite arms on towers so that we can easily upgrade and reinforce the network beyond 2030, as we know that this is just the start of the journey. And a real key part for us is actually local engagement. So engaging with communities, local authority officials, councillors and MPs on the infrastructure. This is something we feel quite strongly about. We see this first decade as the first step towards the net zero challenge. And we could see a world where this infrastructure is felt as a threat, a concern, and a risk, or we want to move and work in a world where actually it's seen as an opportunity, it's green lifeline. So you were talking earlier about local decarbonisation, electrification of transport, decarbonisation of heat. We are really keen that we move away from focusing just on transmission infrastructure, but how can we, through the offshore transmission network review, generate conversation and coordination that we can be part of, that means we have whole systems thinking. So while we're building this net zero PLC infrastructure, how can we make sure we have the right environment and framework that we can work with organisations like UK Power Networks to be bolstering the regional networks to make sure that you can meet your regional decarbonisation ambitions. And equally, we mitigate along these routes, but actually can we think more strategically given the scale of infrastructure and look to build as an industry more strategic natural capital enhancement opportunities. So we're plugging into not only connecting offshore wind, but we're facilitating and supporting local decarbonisation, facilitating and supporting actual local and regional national natural capital strategies. So we're really keen through the Bayes Offshore Transmission Network Review, through our proactive feedback around the planning policy review, which we've already fed in, that we bring in that much wider joined up whole systems and broader thinking around this infrastructure. So it's seen as an exciting opportunity that, yes, will bring disruption, but will also bring real value to a region. We've just finally got 3 kind of key asks that we've been focusing on with government and with wider stakeholders that we think will help facilitate some of this. One is to actually have a holistic blueprint, not just for the offshore network out to 2050, but also the onshore network, so out to 2030. So making sure that actually people feel there is a coordinated, holistic infrastructure plan that speaks to the offshore and onshore requirements, creates certainty and understanding of the infrastructure required, and enables us actually to quickly move to opportunity mitigation, bringing skills, jobs, how we can start to look at local infrastructure as well and work with distribution companies and have the right framework and environment to do that. The other area is around planning. I think we mentioned it in sort of previous conversations, but we do think that planning really does need to reform. We welcome that there's a review of the NPSs and that they better kind of recognise and update to recognise net zero ambition. And we have quite a challenge around regulatory alignment. So at the moment, our funding doesn't really align with kind of the planning process and the development consent order process. It creates an environment where we end up having to very much prove and demonstrate the case for needing to do certain activities around undergrounding, for example, through the planning process to secure funding. And we think that can create a lot of unnecessary upfront kind of community anxiety, when ultimately we feel the outcome could be better landed within planning policy, for example, better engagement from the regulator within the planning process to remove some of that anxiety. So that's effectively what I was going to go through. I've gone through that at quite a pace because I'm cognizant of time. And happy to take any further questions or delve into anything in more detail.
So very many thanks. It's quite clear you've got a major challenge at National Grid, and it's, thanks for giving us a strategic overview. And one of the challenges you mentioned was the with offshore wind, with the review that's going on to offshore networks at the moment. And I think that sets up the scene well for our final speaker, who is Charlie Jordan, who is East Anglia Project Director for Scottish Power Renewables, who are operating, developing and planning some significant wind farms off our coast. Charlie, welcome.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone as well for the opportunity to speak to you today, and really to give a perspective from offshore wind and how we think our industry can support the race to net zero. It's clear there's a need to decarbonise, and believe that the only way to do so is to use the existing technology, and that's to look to electrify our economy. That includes all industries, heating, agricultural, transport. But in order to do this, we need to be producing very large quantities of clean, green energy, bringing that energy online as quickly as possible, but also make sure we can do that at affordable levels. And I think offshore wind certainly ticks all those boxes. And indeed, off the coast of East Anglia is an ideal place, as we've seen from previous experiences, to be developing such projects and bringing more projects online. I think as an industry, we've demonstrated that offshore wind technology works, that it can be deployed at large scale, can be deployed quickly, and also without subsidy. And also the infrastructure can coexist, I think, with both offshore marine environments and onshore environments as well. We've seen very fantastic examples from our recently constructed East Anglia 1 project about some of the benefits that these projects can bring. Our East Anglia 1 project is delivering more than 100 long-term skilled jobs that will run for over the 25 years of the project, not to mention the thousands of jobs created over the construction and the contribution that made into the UK targets of having over 50% of the investment in the UK. We've also seen it stimulated the supply chain with almost 150 million invested, and indeed investments in the local ports of Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth. The project also supported a number of skills and educational programmes at all levels, from primary school children to develop their interest in STEM subjects, all the way up to university master students and taking on apprenticeships as well. And these are all the benefits from now a modest 714 megawatts. East Anglia has the potential to multiply that by almost a factor of 10. In fact, when I was considering those that followed the recent leasing round, you can see there that actually off the coast of East Anglia, we've got the potential to be delivering that capacity for projects that are almost ready to be starting, and indeed looking to participate in the future CFD auction. I think as an industry, it's clear that we've benefited from very good collaboration between industry and government over the last 10 years, and the sector deal was launched in East Anglia. And from that, we've seen a number of areas, such as the targets increasing from 30 to 40 gigawatts by 2030. We have a roadmap for future CFDs, and we're also seeing funds implemented for large infrastructure projects, such as ports, which can only further benefit the industry. And it's very welcoming to see that advancing offshore wind is point number 1 of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. However, there are clearly many more challenges that we need to overcome as we look to take this to the next level. There are a number of big barriers that we need to work both with government and industry, and indeed need cross-government support. And also we're competing in a global market as well, so we need to be making sure that we're benefiting for our advanced position at the moment, and also taking advantage of the expertise we have here and looking to use that for both benefiting UK projects, and then that can also be used for future exporting such skills. Just some examples of some of the barriers I think we need to be addressing. Clearly accelerating consenting. As I mentioned, we've got almost 7 gigawatts of capacity ready to go off the coast of East Anglia, but we need to work through the consenting process, and also make sure that we're supporting all the different levels and departments and organisations that have got a very relevant role to contribute to that process. One of the other big challenges we have as an industry is clearly grid reform, and looking how that can support bringing on all the additional capacity. It's very interesting to hear from Sara there about the challenges that you face, be that technical and policy related, and that's before we get to the stage of even constructing this additional infrastructure. So those solutions are, I guess, in the order of 10 years away, and I think what is very important is that as an industry, we can't wait. We need to continue developing projects and bringing them forward as and when we can. And there's further new technologies that we need to be looking at as well. A key one will be storage and how we can further develop storage to support that. We need to look at more opportunities within for projects. That's making more seabeds available, bringing forward further leasing rounds. And part of that as well will be reducing some of the barriers. And I think a very relevant one for the industry is military radar. and clearly an area where they benefit from what is happening, but very good cross-government support and working with industry as well. But that needs to continue and get to a point of delivering solutions. We also need to continue to develop the supply chain and the skills. You know, we're seeing, and I believe that East Anglia has proven a fantastic place. There's a real wealth of experience, be it through transitioning companies and new companies come into the industry to look to develop the supply chain, and also a great area to be recruiting and training up many of the people for the industry going forward, and make sure we've got the right level of skills and technical experts to further develop this industry. So really, I think in summary from me, I believe that East Anglia is an ideal place for developing offshore wind farms. It's got a very significant place to play, a role to play in achieving the government targets for 2030 and indeed beyond. And I think there's a lot of expertise within East Anglia to help us further develop and solve these industry problems that have been identified. So I would just like to say thank you very much for the opportunity again to speak, and I'm more than happy to discuss any of these points in detail or follow up with anyone that may want to discuss further. Thank you.
Charlie, many thanks for that, and highlighting the opportunities that offshore wind does present to the East Anglian economy. You know, certainly I'm seeing that in my constituency in Lowestoft, where you have made a significant investment in the O&M facility there, which I saw last Friday when we were getting to work on cutting the turf, if you like, on the new flood defence scheme in Lowestoft, which does highlight the challenges we face from climate change, which Daniel emphasised in his project or in his talk. I'm looking for questions or observations on what we've heard from Sally, Sara, and Charlie. Any thoughts? Any questions from anyone? Put up your hand, virtual or otherwise. Yes, Mohammed's got from Bedford has got his hand up. Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's just a very quick comment. I think it was a brilliant session, very informative, very powerful speakers, with a lot of information. I really enjoyed it, and we can see a very good plan for the future, and there are some worries as well, obviously, but I'm very pleased with this session, and I would like to congratulate you and Daniel for arranging this. Very well done. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mohammed, for that for that comment. And Daniel Johns has got his hand up.
Well, just first of all, I think it's really exciting to see all these projects really get off the ground, and the scale of the ambition is really impressive. I mean, the hydrogen economy stuff is fantastic. Obviously, links very nicely with the presentation I think the All Party Parliamentary Group had last time from Anita Thornbury, and I followed up with her afterwards just to check that she wasn't expecting lots of fresh water to be used for hydrogen production, which of course would cause us all kinds of difficulties. But she was keen to point out that it's seawater, and linked to the new Sizewell C proposals, where they already have to turn lots of seawater into kind of fresh water to be able to cool the plant. I guess I wanted to bring back the kind of point that Linda made earlier about the costs of this transition. And point out, of course, first of all, that the Treasury is due to come out with its net zero review very shortly, in terms of what's the best way to share the costs in a fair and equitable way across different sectors of society and people across the country. And that's going to be really key to unlock a right and fair transition to net zero, but also to point out that we know what works in climate policy. If the government sets a consistent policy framework with incentives for infrastructure investors, which are stable and robust and predictable over time, then we will see the success of offshore wind in other sectors too. And I think Linda's concerns about electric vehicles will be gone within a matter of years. They're already much cheaper to run than conventional fueled vehicles. We're seeing more and more models come onto the market all the time. And I think within a couple of years, battery technology would have moved on to such an extent that range anxiety will be a thing of the past. And it will be, the ticket price on the car showroom will be as cheap for an EV as it will be for a fossil fuel vehicle. And that's a really exciting place to be. I'm not sure there's a question in there, but I think partly it's about let's not limit our ambition by the cost that might need to be incurred at some point down the line, as long as we do so in a kind of fair and transparent way.
Daniel, thanks for those further thoughts. And can I ask our speakers just if they've got any feedback on Daniel's observations there?
I was just going to chime in that I absolutely agree on the EVs, and I think it's going to be the charging infrastructure that's going to really help unlock that, because that will be a key point around range anxiety as well. And I think the very pertinent comments around if you can't charge, if you don't have off-street parking, how you overcome that and how we make sure we have the right charging infrastructure in place.
Oh, can I just raise a point myself on that particular issue? I was talking to BP last week, mainly from an offshore perspective and the transition and the role they're playing. But we got on to EV charging, and they say that they will be able to, if you go to their petrol stations, EV stations of the future, you will be able to recharge in the same time that you fill up your car now. Now, to do that, they need a hell of a lot of electricity. And it's a question, how are you going to provide it for them?
I think that comes back to exactly the grid infrastructure is really important, along with the distribution network operator infrastructure as well. So when you talk about market towns, particularly thinking DNO infrastructure. So that's one of our key thoughts around. We're building these big routes potentially through the region. How do we broaden our framework and our policies that facilitate those routes being real lifelines to provide charging infrastructure along motorways, for example, for the grid infrastructure to provide charging for motorway stations so that you can have that vision that BP have, but equally coordinate with distribution network operators like UK Power Networks so we can get charging infrastructure to market towns, for example, and they can have the same facilities. So I think it's like, how do we move, make sure we're not having siloed thinking around offshore transport decarbonisation and electrification of heat, for example, and providing the power for hydrogen production to real whole systems thinking and coordination.
Well, you're on mute, Peter.
Yes, second, many thanks for that. Sally, any further observations on that?
Yes, I was just going to say that I totally agree with Daniel on his observations around not being preoccupied necessarily with the costs that will come about. Obviously, you know, from a hydrogen perspective, hydrogen is more expensive than natural gas at the moment. But I think, you know, we are literally at the base of a very steep climb in terms of a surge in improvements and development in the hydrogen sector, and we see the costs coming down rapidly. And I think that the reference to offshore wind is a really helpful one. You know, we see hydrogen going the same way. Obviously, it will need some support in the early days and some subsidy. But I think it's important to have courage, because we need to get to net zero. We can't, you know, we need the electrification and we need the gaseous energy storage vector. So we just need to hold tight and stay brave.
Sally, in highlighting the role that hydrogen can play, you mentioned there learning the lessons of offshore wind, and I think that brings us onto Tom Williamson from Scottish Power, who's got his hand up. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I just want to jump in quickly on the electric vehicle stuff that we were talking about there. I just want to echo what Sarah was saying. It's a really interesting point. Scottish Power is, so you know, isn't just a renewables developer with the offshore wind farms. We're also the retailer, but with distribution network operator in Merseyside, North Wales, as well as Central Coast of Scotland. I think Sarah's point there about the need to avoid siloed thinking, make sure that DNOs, distribution network operators, are joined up with all this is really important. I'm sure that UKPM will be coming to bang on your doors about the forthcoming price review that's coming up, which I think is going to be a really important one in terms of preparing the way for electric vehicles investing ahead of need. Because I think you could, if we're not very careful, if the point that Daniel was making there about the demand curve sort of taking off for EVs, if we're not careful and we don't get ahead of the infrastructure, you could very well get to a point where we're having to say to people, actually, sorry, we can't allow you to charge your electric car, your nice newly bought Tesla at home, because if you do, you might accidentally blow up the street because 3 of your neighbours got there before you, and that's going to be really quite damaging for the curve for electric vehicles. The other thing, just on that BP point you're making, Peter, I think there's going to be a real sort of paradigm shift in how people fill up their cars when it comes. I think we all as people sort of think about how we do things at the moment and then try and transfer that across. So I think there'll be much less fast charging in the time that it takes to fill up your car with petrol, which is going to be a hugely expensive way to charge up your electric vehicle. BP have obviously got a vested interest in people doing that. I think there'll be much more of the way we charge up the batteries on our phones, thinking, oh, I better plug my phone in to make sure I've got enough battery to listen to a podcast on the train home tonight, rather than I need to let it run down to 3% and then charge it back up to 100%. So I think that all these behavioural shifts will be, none of us really know what those are going to look like, but I think things will change on that front. But coming back to the point we're making, what we're talking about here, the infrastructure underpinning all that electric vehicle stuff and the electric heating that we're talking about, the zero carbon homes, that's all going to be really important for the future going forward if we're going to be able to actually achieve any of it.
Many thanks for that very helpful observation. Sally or Sara, any quick observations on? Yep.
Well, I was just going to touch back on a few points. I think absolutely right around that. How do we make sure we coordinate across the DNOs, the transmission network, but how do we make sure we have the right framework to do that, and policies and regulation? I think we also touched on that point around anticipatory investment. That's not a world we've generally been in, or the frameworks that we've had that sort of supports that kind of need for anticipatory investment. So there's a real shift around how we regulate, and that move to net zero regulation that's really important to support this. I think as well, and this is where I have a knowledge gap, but I think the Welsh Assembly has set up a more holistic approach of bringing transmission and distribution, for example, together to create a group that really does bring that whole systems approach and thinking. And others might be able to jump in and add in more on that. But I think that's a really great model and something we should be pushing for all regions and nationally as well. Yeah, certainly that was what I was going to add on. And I think the slow charging point is a really good one as well, that we will probably slow charge at home, but how do we bring in some of that fast charging at, for example, shops, strategic road networks, major shopping centre car parks and things like that, so that you have both. So it's never one answer, it's making sure we have a mix of all those answers.
Peter, just thank you. I think when Tom was talking about, the 2 or 3 cars that already had charging points on the street, and then the house that tipped it over the edge, I think that what that's illustrating is that it's extremely important for the electricity networks to work with the gas networks, because if you take that scenario and then you also add heat pumps into it, you're definitely going to blow the budget, aren't you? So in some locations it might be that hydrogen heating is the best option because of constraints in the electricity network. So whether that's exactly. So just an important point really, that we're trying to work as much as we can in a collaborative way and take a whole systems approach to planning.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Sara. I'm reminded we are going to sort of close at 11:30, but I see we got one last question. So over to you. It is Carol, isn't it? From
it's Cheryl. Thanks.
Carol,
thanks
my apologies. It didn't come up properly. That's apologies.
That's okay. I'm sort of still here trying to digest the scale of the national grid kind of numbers and project, which was quite mind-blowing. And I was just reflecting on one other aspect of this. Is there any modelling that's going on around the impact that level of supplies and materials will have on our freight system? And we've got 2 transport strategies in the region. We probably need to think about how those align.
That's a great question. I mean, we are literally building our procurement strategies at the moment because, as you pointed out, it's a huge amount of infrastructure. So we are looking at strategic supply chain sourcing, how we do this. But I think the freight is a really good point. How we literally transport this stuff in and out is a great shout. So we're probably at the point where we're just looking at how we make sure we can source and what it means to source all the materials and resources we need. But you're right, there's then that really practical point of logistics.
Many thanks, Sara. Now, as I said, we've got 7 more minutes left, and I sense we need to be bringing matters to wrapping them up. So many thanks to Sally, Sara, and Charlie for their our speakers in the last session. And it's been a very good session. Generally, we've heard, I think Baroness Brown talked about the opportunities of a climate cabinet across the region, which personally I think is a very, very good idea. And obviously one needs to think carefully how one puts that in place. I think from Daniel, it was quite clear Anglian Water have long advanced from being just a water company. They are thinking outside the box and very clearly recognise the threats and indeed the challenges and the threats and indeed the opportunities that our region has. Sally, when it came on, highlighted the opportunities of hydrogen. I've been talking about hydrogen as being the new kid on the block. It's now no longer such a new kid, and we must talk about it as the Swiss Army knife of energy production. I think Sara highlighted the opportunities, the enormous challenge we face and the need to take a strategic approach the national grid need to do. Also great business opportunities, and she mentioned that with the comment with Portsmouth to Perth, and as I said, not Perth, Scotland, but Perth, Western Australia. And then Charlie highlighted those opportunities that offshore wind presents in the local economy. And I think also we just had some good pointers as to how we can perhaps take thinking and plan ideas that are taking place outside our region and blend them and shape them to do for our area. I think as Sara's just highlighted the opportunity to see what they're doing in the Welsh Assembly covering Wales, and also earlier Sally highlighted what they're doing at HyNet in the northwest. I think that one of the things we obviously, when this report is finished, and Devo Connect, our secretariat, will now be looking to pull it all together. I think it will make compelling reading, and it will be something that we need to be present to government and lobby hard to make sure that they fully recognise the opportunities here in the East. I think we probably should be looking, I think, and I'd look to Stephen, the Secretariat, to try to pull this all together in a sort of letter to Bays, to the Secretary of State, Kwasi Kwarteng, just to highlight the growing opportunities, and if you like, to act as a trailer for the main event, which will be the report, which will be landing on his and others' desks in the next few weeks and months. So I think if everyone agrees, Steve, along with Daniel Zeichman and myself, we will get together and get such a letter off to Quasi. Our next meeting is going to be on the 7th July from 10 again, same time, 10 a.m. to 11:30. And it will be by Zoom unless you hear otherwise. And this will be the first session in the East of England Levelling Up inquiry. So we've got two very important inquiries now taking place. And another trailer is that, fingers crossed, our next physical event on the terrace in the House of Commons will be the launch of the Green Recovery Inquiry findings, and that's due to take place on Wednesday, 8th September from 4 to 6 p.m. So that's very much one for your diaries. And I will just finish by thanking all the speakers for your very excellent speeches and some thought-provoking ideas. Also the attendees, for all of you coming here, we couldn't do it without you, and all our sponsors, and also to our secretariat, Steve and his team at Devo Connect. And on that line, I would just hand over back to Steve for a few passing sort of thoughts and housekeeping reminders. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks to you for chairing today. And I know stepping in when Daniel had a few problems in terms of his capacity to do that. So very good. Basically, just to reiterate what you've said, we'll do a letter. We'll be incorporating the findings from what I thought was an excellent meeting today into the kind of report that hopefully will be launched in September. There's still some uncertainty about that, but you will be kept posted. But we'll definitely have the next meeting on levelling up inquiry. We're going to be looking at fishing ports, social mobility, and levelling up white paper. So it should be a good meeting, and look forward to seeing you.